Hey everyone, and welcome to another installment in our Halo implementation series. With me again today, I have my favorite person at Halo, Mr. Halo himself. As I'm sure you all know who he is by now, he is the legendary legend of all legends, Mr. Morgan Aspinall. So, hey Morgan, how you doing? And thanks for joining me.
Yeah, how's it going? You're not getting sick of this yet? I'm not.
I'm not.
All right,
I'm not.
we keep going.
And only because every time I say that, I see the smile on your face, and it brightens up my day. And I know how much you love it, mate. So I'm going to keep stroking your ego until there's no more ego left to stroke.
Yeah. Love, awesome.
So
okay,
yeah,
cool.
Today we're going to talk about labor billing. You know what it's about, how to use it, how to tie it into agreements. You know, in the previous video we talked about setting up agreements and contracts. So go and watch that video if you haven't already watched it. And then in this video, we'll talk specifically around how to bill for labor as part of a contract, and also, you know, how to bill for it outside of a contract, you know, stuff that isn't included and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So a slight correction on that. We'll see how far we can get, but I'm not sure if we will talk about how to bill labor as part of a contract just yet. The reason being is I like to follow a sort of fairly standard procedure when it comes to teaching people about billing in Halo. So I like to start off, as we have done, with the creation of an invoice, then the creation of a recurring invoice, then the creation of an agreement, because those are all in a very similar domain, namely invoice generation for, you know, hardware and for licenses, for example.
Yeah.
I then, and this is what I'm going to say now, I then like to tell people to completely forget everything I just said about billing and effectively start from scratch, but start from scratch from the labor billing perspective. So in this session, we'll look at the concept of charge types, where they are amended, how we can change them per customer, how we actually mark labor in Halo as billable, and some of the configuration options around there. And then I like to finally tie the two together by looking at our billing templates and our billing plan combinations in Halo. So we do all of the recurring stuff, which we've done in the last 2 or 3 sessions. We're now going to look at something that initially can be treated as completely separate from our agreements. Then, after we've done that, and we've got a good understanding of the concept of charge rates and billable time, then we will come back and we'll look at billing plan combinations and how to tie the two together. So yeah. So as I mentioned, forget everything that you've seen in the last couple of sessions with regards to billing. We're going to start completely from scratch, take a new angle, and look at labor billing.
So if you've just watched all the previous videos, I'm sorry for wasting your time. We're going to start off again.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, I'm kidding with you guys. But yeah, and it's good. It's good to kind of come at it from, you know, from this different angle that you're going to talk about. So
yeah. It will just help simplify things conceptually, I think. Cool. So before we even look at billing for labor, let's think about labor and let's take it all the way back to square one. So we're going to go into our ticket. And the first point that I like to note here is, the first point that I like to note here is should just get an understanding of time tracking in general in Halo. So time tracking in Halo is a bottom-up process. And what I mean by that is the time recorded on a ticket is a collection of all of the individual time entries that have been added to the ticket via our actions. At the minute, we have 0 minutes recorded on this ticket. If I go to add a private note, we'll see we have our time taken field here. If I just override what we have in the timer in the top right, and I just say I'm just going to put 5 minutes on here, we will now see 5 minutes is added to the time recorded field. And then we've got our 5 minutes added to that individual action. So time is added via our actions, and the time recorded on a ticket is a summation of all of those individual time entries. Cool. So we put 5 minutes on here. The next question, and to start bringing billing into the conversation, is how do we make this time on this action billable, or how do we make time on actions billable? And we do that by applying a charge type to the particular action. So if I go to my private note, I do the same thing, just put 5 minutes on there. We'll see that we have this charge type field against the action. It's currently set to no charge, but if I hit the drop down here and I change this to remote support, we'll notice a couple of things have just happened. So firstly, against our time taken in brackets, we see remote support. So this is the first indication of this time entry potentially being billable. If we add a charge type to our action, we will see that charge type returned on the action next to the time taken. So of course, the action below, I didn't set a charge type, it was no charge. So we see no charge type, but here, because I set remote support, that is added next to our time taken field. And then further to that, we can actually see directly below that this time, those 5 minutes have been billed. Now, as we continue to sort of move through the billing and start taking a look at billing plan combinations, and you tie this back to our agreement and our prepay time, we'll see that it doesn't always say billed hours here. If the time on this ticket, or the time added on this action has gone towards block hours, we would see this as prepay time instead. Just worth bearing in mind. And then finally, we have below our time recorded field a summation of all of the billable time that has been added onto our ticket. Cool. So just before we hop off the ticket screen, two other places that you can go to get an understanding of the billing details against this ticket. First and foremost, for each action, if we view/edit that action, we'll see we have a time tracking tab at the top. And then in our time tracking tab, we have all of our billing details. So, is this time entry billable? If it is billable, is it in our ready for invoicing section? Has it been invoiced? If so, what's the invoice number? What are the billed hours? What are the agreement hours, and so on? So this can give you an overview of all of the relevant billing details for this particular action. And then we also have this billing tab at the top of the ticket, which again is going to give us a high level overview of all of the billable time across all of our different charge types that have been added to this ticket. Cool. So let's now take a look at these charge types in a little bit more detail. So I hit the drop down here, we see that I had no charge, remote support, and on-site support. So where do we go to configure these? Well, we go to configuration, believe it or not. And in here, we go into billing, and then we go into charge types. So this is where we can add, change, remove the list of charge types that we have at our disposal. And for each particular charge type, we've got a few options to consider here. So firstly, we've got our details tab. Again, high level information against this particular charge type, the name that you'll see in the drop down, whether or not we're using this for labor or for travel. We'll come back to that. Don't worry about that just yet. Our linked item. So when we eventually sync the invoices for remote support over to our accounts package, how does QuickBooks or Xero, Sage know what line item we're actually referring to. So that's based on this linked item option. Again, we can also set our product ID, our nominal code for our labor items. And then below here, we have our short and long invoice line descriptions, where we'll see that we can actually use our ticket dollar variables in here. So, of course, when the invoice is generated for the time on ticket 1234, you'll probably want to return some information regarding ticket 1234. You know, maybe the notes that the agent added to resolve the ticket, the amount of time that they spent on that ticket, the ticket ID, the summary, that kind of stuff. So we can actually return our ticket level information back onto the invoice based on our invoice line description for our respective charge types.
Yeah.
And then the rates tab is where we're actually specifying the sort of billing information against this charge type. What's the hourly rate? What's our minimum minutes, etc. So we'll see in here, we have our hourly rate. I'm just going to cover the core options in here. We'll come back to the more advanced options when we have a better understanding of how the whole engine works. But the fundamental fields are rate, our minimum and increment of minutes. So I might want my remote support to be a minimum of 30 minutes, and I might want my remote support to move up in 15-minute increments thereafter. Our out of hours multiplier, so I might charge time and a half for you know, remote support outside of my business hours, which is based on my SLA. Yeah. And then here we've got our contract multiplier, our holiday multiplier as well, and our contract multiplier. We'll come back to this when we have a look at our billing plans. So yeah, for now, we'll leave that as it is. Cool. So I've made a couple of adjustments there. Namely, I adjusted my minimum minutes and my increment of minutes. So if I go back to my ticket now, this one, and I add a private note in. Again, I'll put 5 minutes on here for remote support. We'll see now, again, got my 5 minutes, got my remote support, but below my billed hours has been marked as 30 instead of 5. This is because I set my minimum minutes for remote support to be 30 minutes. This is also a good opportunity to highlight the fact that the action below has not automatically updated. So it's worth bearing in mind that if we're amending billing information, charge rates, you know, billing plans themselves, whether or not time is covered under an agreement or not, it's not, you can't assume that all of the information already added to tickets will be updated automatically. To really make sure that you're using the latest billing configuration as per your setup, you will want to recalculate billing after making any of those changes. There's a couple of places we can do that. So we can recalculate billing on an action by action basis. So if I come in here, I'll see a recalculate billing option at the top. Or if I click that, we'll see my billed hours has gone from 5 minutes to 30 minutes. We also have the option at ticket level to recalculate billing for all actions on a ticket. That's at the bottom of the 3 dots in the top right. Or we have the option to bulk recalculate billing for multiple tickets by selecting the tickets that we want to recalculate billing for. And again, in the edit section, we have our recalculate billing option just there. Yep. Cool. So let's create an invoice for this. Let's see how it looks. So we've got 1 hour of billable time. This is ticket 2214. So our labor is invoiced via the ready for invoicing section. So if we go to our invoices module and we go to our ready for invoicing section, we'll see in here, we have our labor section here. And this is where all of that billable time will land. So interestingly, ticket 2214 is not present in our labor section. And the reason for that is because our ticket is not yet closed. So if I go through the motions.
And this is an interesting thing while you're talking about that. So for anyone coming in from, from Autotask especially, that is looking to switch to Halo, that's one thing that's very different. With Autotask by default, a ticket can be billed at any stage. So you can bill it when it's in progress, when it's new, when it's complete. And the idea is that you can then kind of bill as you go, right? You might have done some work, want some money in, get the money in, but the ticket is still open and carry on. And you can set that setting in Halo so that you can mark it so that it can do the same thing. But by default out of the box, the ticket has to be completed before it gets billed, before that labor gets billed in Halo.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll see that after I close that ticket off, that time entry, that ticket, sorry, has now landed in the labor section of our ready for invoicing.
Yeah.
I would do it this way. I don't like the idea of billing for an incident before the incident has been marked as resolved. But Chris, as you mentioned, there is the option to invoice, or there is the option to mark time on open tickets as being ready to be invoiced. And that option is in configuration, billing, general, under our charge type settings, where here we have this process actions on open tickets.
Yeah.
So again, for those people coming from other PSA tools that are used to working in that way, namely are used to invoicing for time on open tickets and don't want to lose that functionality, all you have to do is come into the general settings for billing in Halo and check this box here.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I mean, I think, it's always better to bill tickets when they complete, but there is certain use cases where you might want to, maybe it's an ongoing ticket and it's taking a long time for that ticket to be resolved for whatever reason, and it's break fix. You don't want to wait 6 months before that ticket is complete, because it could be a bunch of other reasons as to why it's not complete. And you don't want to have to wait. Firstly, wait for your money, and secondly, send the customer a chuffing great big invoice, for £5,000 because it's taking you so long to do all the work on that. So you might have an agreement with your customer that kind of goes, you know what, we'll just bill you as we go. We'll bill you a couple of hours here, a couple of hours there, and we'll just keep billing you as and when. So I think there's definitely a use case for that, but I do think having the ability to to mark tickets when they are complete, I think I agree with you. I think it's, in most cases, that's probably what you're going to do. You're not really going to have, a lot of scenarios where tickets might take a long time to complete, and then you would be only billing at the end. But it's up to you. The option's there. It gives you the flexibility to be able to do that if you want to.
Yeah. And what you might actually want to do is you might want to find the middle ground in Halo, whereby you make use of this option called ticket review processing.
Yeah.
So ticket review processing basically adds a holding area for billable time entries prior to those time entries going into the ready for invoicing section. So with that use case, you've got a long ongoing incident and you want to, it's been going on for 6 months. You want to bill the first 4 months of it or the first 5 months of it. You can't close it off yet because the issue hasn't been resolved. But you also don't then want time entries thereafter to immediately go into ready for invoicing. So what you can do there is enable our ticket review processing. And what that does is that adds an additional section into our invoices module, namely this awaiting review section here. So our awaiting review section is going to include effectively all time entries that have not yet been reviewed. And what's nice about this as well, again, jumping the gun a little bit, but taking a step back, what's nice about this is when you do have your billing plan combination set up, and when you do have some time going to an agreement and some time being considered as billable, you might want to actually make sure that the billable time is in fact billable and is not covered by an agreement, but the agent has just, you know, made a mistake somewhere. Or similarly, you might want to make sure that time that is being consumed by an agreement is being done so correctly, and you're not missing out on any of that billable labor. So this awaiting review section will give you the option to have a breakdown of your sort of sub lists for the different types of billable time in the system, or more generally, the different types of time, whether they are billable, which is non-contract / prepay. So that's everything that would go onto an invoice that hasn't yet been reviewed.
Yeah.
There is contract / prepay, that is time that has been consumed by the block hours or by the agreement. And then there is overages here as well, where this is saying that the time entries have been allocated to an agreement, but we've actually gone over the allotted hours. So this will go onto an invoice despite it actually going towards an agreement. Again, we go back to that example that we saw in the last session, or that we discussed in the last session, where you have an agreement that's got 8 hours support per month. At hour 10, you want that to be billable, but you still want to denote that that has gone to the agreement. So that's what an overage would be considered as.
And I think where this awaiting review is also a really good thing, and I see this quite often, is, you know, a lot of MSPs might have, you know, the service desk manager or somebody who's actually reviewing the time before it goes to billing, right? Because the service desk manager may know that actually, yeah, this work should be billable or not billable, whereas, you know, somebody in the accounts team isn't necessarily going to know. You know, maybe the SDM was on a call with a customer and said, okay, you know, we would normally charge you for this, but in this instance, we're not going to charge you. But the engineer has accidentally made it chargeable. So at least then the SDM can come in here and say, okay, I'm going to review this. And like I say, should it be chargeable? Should it not be chargeable? Are we charging the correct rate? All those kind of things, and be able to override that before it actually goes into the ready for invoicing, so that when it gets to the ready for invoicing, then accounts knows that everything that's in there is accurate and good to go and can just be billed. So I kind of like that. I like that extra step in there. So I just think it gives you, especially if you're a bigger company, you know, if you're a smaller MSP, you're probably not going to need to have this in, but certainly as a bigger MSP, you may need to have that extra approval level being put into place.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Yeah,
cool. One other important configuration option in config billing general under our charge type settings is this calculate charge rounding at ticket level. So let's go back to that ticket. And so we've added two actions onto, we've added two billable actions onto our ticket, this one and this one. We've added 5 minutes each time, so effectively 10 minutes of actual work has been put into these two actions. However, our billable time recorded is 1 hour.
Yep.
So the reason for that is because this option is disabled. And when this option is disabled, the charge type minimums and the charge type roundings are evaluated on an action by action basis. So remember how I set my minimum minutes to be 30 for my remote support?
Yep.
Well, that means that each individual time entry, if it's less than 30 minutes have been added in, will go to 30. And if I add 31 minutes onto the next time entry, it will be 45 minutes. So the majority of people that I speak with want this option enabled, because with this option enabled, what we'll find is the total billable time for the ticket is evaluated based on the charge roundings for my individual charge types. So I think that's probably just cached, but what we can see is after I went in here and I recalculated my billing, we'll see now my build hours on this action is 5 minutes and my build hours on this action is 25 minutes, rounding up, there we go, rounding up to that minimum of 30 across all of the actions on the ticket.
Yeah, that makes much more sense, having that button ticked.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So let's take a look at what we get on the invoice. So I'm going to go ahead, go into my ready for invoicing section, click my labor entry, click create invoice at the top. And let's take a look at this. So first point to note, the invoice description is as we saw it set up in our charge type configuration, where our dollar variables, dollar fault ID, dollar symptom, etc., have been replaced with the ticket specific information. The second point to note that, you know, some is a sort of split school of thought. The second point to note is we have two lines here, right? Because we had two billable actions. Some people would rather have one single line with all of the time added onto that one single line. We can handle that as well. And that is set up within configuration billing general under our invoice creation settings. Where in here, right at the top, we have this grouping for labor lines. So at the minute, there is no grouping. And that means that every single individual billable action on a ticket or on any ticket that would go onto an invoice would be its own individual line.
Yep.
If you instead want to group that, you'll see a couple of grouping options in here. Probably the most common is grouping by ticket and rate. So let's take a look at the invoice if we set that as our grouping. Also, really handy point for people as they're sort of playing about with Halo and understanding invoices in general. Any invoice that is created from the ready for invoicing section, if you delete that invoice, those records go back into ready for invoicing. So, you know, if we go back, if we go in here, of course, my labor section is now empty because I just created the invoice for that labor and, you know, we're not going to be invoicing that again. However, if I delete my invoice, that flows back in here. So for the sake of, you know, as you're getting to grips with things and you're fiddling about with the billing settings, it can often be quite, it could be a faster method to just get a test ticket, if we're talking about labor billing, create an invoice for it, change the settings, delete the invoice, recreate it, and have a look at the outcome, which in this case, our two lines have now been wrapped up into one single line, and that quantity, that decimal hour quantity, it has been rolled up accordingly. Again, as a side point, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but again, I want to make sure that people are aware of this, and we'll probably come back to this later on another session. A common question that comes up at this point is, okay, yeah, so I want all of my labor to be wrapped up onto as few lines as possible. So I want to group by ticket and by rate, but I actually still want to show the customer a breakdown of where that half an hour has gone. So I do want to give them supplementary information. I just don't want every single line to go over to QuickBooks. We can, on our invoice PDFs, include a report, or include any report for that matter, And what that means is a report can be created. We've already got one in the system. A report can be created for billable time per invoice, and we can then return that report onto the invoice document where we can see, the invoice itself, one line, half an hour, and then a supplementary page that provides the notes as to where that half an hour has gone. So just something to bear in mind.
Yeah.
Cool. So I know we're getting on, but there's still a couple of other points that I want to make sure people are aware of when it comes to labor billing. And the next point is default charge rates. So we saw previously that we can add time onto our tickets and we can specify a charge type, but by default, the charge type that's being selected is no charge. If this is how you want to work, fantastic. However, there is always that risk of your technicians not selecting the correct charge rate or not selecting any billable rate, meaning that they might put 6 hours onto a ticket and just forget to change this, and at which point you've just lost out on 6 hours of potentially billable time. So we can default the option that is selected in here. There's a couple of places that we can default that. The first place that I want to mention is within the actions themselves, right? So within each individual action, under our defaults tab, we do have the ability to set a default charge type. So this is a good way of being quite granular as to what actions would be billable by default. Customer-facing actions like emailing the customer, you may well want to default that to remote support. However, something like a private note, you might want to leave that as being non-billable by default. Yeah. Cool. So that's one place. We will see that we have this option here to actually not set a default. And if we're not setting a default, then that default can be inherited from our ticket type or from our agent. So our ticket type default is set within the details tab, I think, ironically. Yeah, down here where we have our charge type override, and then the other place, agent level, is set against the agent details here, default charge type, which I quite like the concept of, because that allows you to create like a level 1, level 2, level 3 rate, or junior architect, network architect, and they all have their own unique rate. And then based on the individual who is adding time onto those tickets, that rate would be inherited. But yeah, so those are the places you can set those defaults.
Yeah, I kind of like that as well. I often set it up at the agent level, because like you're saying, then at least that, and if you select that option that says that it gets inherited from there, you'll always know that each engineer will always, or agent as Halo calls it, will always be billed at the correct rate, right? They're not then having to, and they also then don't have to decide, right? They don't have to go and pick something to say this is the charge rate or this is the whatever. They just do their work, and kind of Halo takes care of all the billing for that. So yeah, I like doing it at the agent level. I think it's much nicer.
So now we can very quickly see, if I click private note, on-site support is selected. On-site support has been selected because the private note charge type is no default, and my agent charge type is on site, hence that's why we're getting on site. And then if I click email user, we'll see that remote support is selected.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's how we can default those charge types and not have to worry about the technicians manually picking those each and every time. The other place where charge types can be configured is at customer level. So we saw in configuration billing, we can set our global defaults for our charge types up. So that's where we actually create the charge types. That's where we set the default rate for them. However, you'll probably find that you have customers that are grandfathered in and they get a slightly better rate than those newer customers, or you might find that as a customer that is a particularly hard place to get to, so on-site might be a little bit more expensive for them. The point is, charge types will likely diverge slightly from one customer to the next. And so what we could do there is we can go to our customer record, we can go to our billing tab, where in here we have a couple of options. The ones that we're going to be looking at now are our charge type restrictions and our overriding charge types. So the overriding charge types allow us to select from the list of existing charge types that we have in the system, and then from that, allocate some specific charge type configuration to this particular customer. So maybe this customer actually has their remote support at £40 or $40 an hour as opposed to 50. Again, we set our minimum, our increments, set our multipliers, and we're good. And then the other place where charge types can be manipulated on a customer by customer basis is in our charge type restrictions section, where for a given customer, we can actually restrict the available options that the available charge types that we can make use of. So, you might have different charge types for different types of work, but a customer might actually not have the ability to have that type of work allocated to them. So this will probably make a bit more sense when we look at our billing plan combinations. However, we might have different charge types for our different types of agreements, whereby the selection of the respective charge type allocates the time on that action to go to the agreement that we have set up. However, if a customer doesn't have a particular agreement, we might not want to allow that charge type to be selected at all. So we can come in here and actually specify the particular types, charge types that will be allowed for this particular customer.
Yeah, and I see that happen quite a lot. I mean, I see a lot of MSPs that I work with, and when I used to run my MSP is there's certain, like I say, maybe based on where they are or what have you, it might be that, hey, we only offer on-site support to this customer, right? We don't offer any kind of remote support, or vice versa. We only offer remote support. They're too far away to get to. So that's where you'd then kind of restrict your charge type and go, well, this customer's only ever going to be able to. We're only ever going to be able to do remote support or pick that charge type at least for this particular customer. And I see that quite a lot. I see a lot of people kind of saying, based on location. I mean, I actually had an MSP whose customer was in the same building as them, like in the floor above. And they basically are like, well, there's no point us doing remote support. We might as well get in the elevator and actually go to this customer. So they pretty much only ever do on-site support with them. They don't charge them a higher rate for that because it's an elevator or a lift ride up to where they are, or going up the stairs if you're feeling very energetic. But it's and in those instances, you might want to be able to change these based on who those customers are, and set those charge type restrictions. So
probably worth mentioning as well that the options in here are the allowed options. It's not very obvious, but this would mean that only remote support could be used. Yeah. Cool. So that was a fairly lengthy session. I think that's a good place to wrap things up. So what we've covered in this session is the concept of charge types, how we can bill for labor, how we can invoice for time on tickets, some of the associated configuration regarding that functionality, how we configure our charge types, how we set our charge type rounding, the awaiting review section, etc. And basically, we've just looked at labor billing as its own entity. We still don't know how the time on these tickets actually gets added to an agreement or actually chipped away against some block hours. And that's what we will be covering in our next session, where we have a look at billing plan combinations and we tie everything billing related that we've seen so far together and provide a bit more of a holistic overview. And yeah, we'll go from there.
Absolutely. And once again, thank you, Morgan, for your time. And if anyone's hit this video and is completely confused at this point, go back and watch some of the other videos. I'll link to them there somewhere, wherever they are. And go back and watch the other videos, because it is kind of going through a flow in a particular sequence. If there's any questions, put them in the notes below. We'll make sure that we get those addressed. And then, as Morgan said, what we'll do on the next video is we'll cover billing plan combinations and show how to bill the stuff as part of the contract, and then go from there. So yeah, really appreciate it once again, Morgan, and big shout out to Halo for letting us do these and for allowing us to use your time. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you on the next video.
Yeah, as always, pleasure to be here and help and do my bit for the community.
Excellent. Thanks very much. See you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.